Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation. Today we're talking about the surge in attacks and arrests of journalists while they're doing their jobs.
The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world.
I'm Sandy Johnson, president of the National Press Foundation. How should journalists respond when they're shoved up against a wall, arrested for shouting questions, evicted from public spaces, or body slammed by politicians? Today we're talking about how to cope in an increasingly hostile environment. With me in the studio today are Kevin Goldberg, a media attorney with Fletcher, Heald, and Hildreth, and chairman of the NPF Board of Directors, and also John Donnelly, a national security reporter with CQ Roll Call and chair of the National Press Club's Press Freedom Committee. Thank you for joining us today. So, John, let's start with you. You're an award-winning journalist. You've been reporting for 25 years. Tell us what happened to you at the Federal Communications Commission.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. And I guess I should say first that what happened to me is not nearly as severe as what has happened to a lot of journalists, but it was poor treatment, and I'm glad we shone a light on what happened. So I'm a defense reporter, as you said. I don't normally go to the Federal Communications Commission. I got a tip. I was hopeful that one of the commissioners might just confirm what I had heard. So they had a meeting that day on the subject of net neutrality, and they had a press conference. I attended. I sat with the reporters. To get into that room, I had to go through a metal detector. I had to have my congressional press pass photographed. I had to get a pass, etc. So I sat with the reporters, but during the press conference, I didn't want to ask my question in front of all the other reporters because I didn't want to tip everyone off to what I was working on. So what I wanted to do was hang around the fringes and hope to catch one of the commissioners as they walked off and ask them a question. Several of the security guards were shadowing me in a weird way. You know, it was like, is he following me? Yes, I think he is, but I wasn't quite sure. At one point, Commissioner Mike O'Reilly was walking off the stage after having taken questions, and I went up to ask him my question, and two of the security guards who had been positioning themselves between me and him backed up into me and pinned me up against the wall with their backs, and they held me there for several seconds while O'Reilly walked off. I wasn't beaten. They didn't use their hands, but they definitely used their bodies to physically knock me up against the wall. And I asked them why they did that, and the one guy, who I later found out was the head of security at the Federal Communications Commission, said, "Why didn't you ask your question during the press conference?" Which told me, number one, he knows I'm a reporter, and number two, that's his beef with me, this imagined violation. So I went to use the restroom. I came out, and they're there waiting for me. I took a left turn, and I started heading toward an area that was restricted. There was a sign that said restricted. Simultaneous with my registering that, they said, "Hey, where are you going? You know, can we help you find something?" In a not very nice way. I said, "I'm just trying to get back to the meeting room." Remember, I'd never been there before. I was a little rattled by what they had just done. So, but I never entered any restricted area. So I went back to the meeting room. I looked around, see if I could find anybody else who might be helpful to me. I wasn't able to. I decided to leave. They tailed me right to the turnstile out to the lobby. And so I walk out through the turnstile, and then I go and I sit down on a wooden chair in the lobby just before you exit the building. And I'm trying to gather myself and think what I'm going to do about what just happened to me. And this guy who's the head of security walks out to me and says, "Do you have any further business here at the Federal Communications Commission?"
So by the way, let me ask you something. This was outside the security, because I know the FCC building, so you have to go through security. You had now exited security and were in a completely public area.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it was a public area. Well, it was I guess you would call a public area where the meeting was happening too. It was a public meeting. But yeah, I was outside the whole security zone.
Yeah.
Sitting in a chair, just trying to gather my thoughts. He comes right out and says, "Do you have any further business here at the Federal Communications Commission?" I said no, and then I said, actually, yes, I think I'm going to try to talk to public affairs. And he said, do you have an appointment? And I said, no. And he said, well, then I suggest you leave. In other words, if I wasn't going to leave, he was going to make me leave, right? So I said, fine. I looked very closely at his name tag and made a note of his name. I went outside. I actually talked to a couple other reporters who were there, and they told me that this guy had been a problem before. Yeah. And they suggested who I contact, so I fired off an email to the public affairs people at the FCC and I CC'd all the commissioners, and I explained just what happened. And then subsequently I told the National Press Club about it, and they put out a statement. My employer later wrote a letter to the FCC about it, and the story ended up going viral, and they had some explaining to do, for good reason.
And some senators got involved too, right?
Yes, that's right. Senator Chuck Grassley issued a statement, and then two Democratic senators, Hassan and Udall, wrote a letter to the FCC chairman, Ajit Pai, asking for an explanation. And several weeks later, he wrote them back. And in his letter, he parroted what the security people had obviously told him about what happened. And their explanation was that they perceived me to be a security threat. They said that there had been some death threats against commissioners. They perceived me to be a security threat. They said I tried to access restricted areas. They cited my left turn instead of right, saying that I tried to enter the restricted area, which I did not try to enter. They also said that I tried to take an elevator to another floor to enter a restricted area. I never even touched an elevator button. I may have walked past a bank of elevators. So that was their explanation. They perceived me to be a threat. Well, I think about a cop who shoots some guy just walking down the street and then says, oh, I perceived him to be a threat, even though he wasn't doing anything to suggest that. In other words, misperception is not a defense. And I said to some people afterwards, if they perceive me, and by the way, I was wearing this suit, I had my press pass, I had a notebook, a tape recorder, and by his answer, when I asked him why he did that, he told me he knew I was a reporter, right? Mm-hmm. So there's no question of who I was or what I was doing. But anyway, I said, if they perceive me to be a security threat, that is their top security problem. Yeah. The failure to be able to adequately discern what's a real threat and what's not.
What's dangerous, right?
So the chairman, unfortunately, added insult to injury by questioning my version of events, and by suggesting, again, parroting what the security people told him, suggesting that I misled people about what happened. And I'm telling you the God's honest truth of what happened. Again, I wasn't beaten up. It wasn't the most awful thing in the world. But not only did they pin me against the wall, but they forced me to leave the building, which sometimes has gotten lost in the reporting on it. It's just reporter pinned by guards, and also thrown out of the building, or not literally, but under implied threat of force.
Right. Let's talk about another recent case that Kevin wound up having a role in. Dan Heyman, a journalist for Public News Service in West Virginia, shouted a question at the HHS secretary who was visiting in the Capitol building in Charleston. So let's take a look at that video. Kevin, tell us how you got involved in this case.
Well, my involvement was really quite minimal, but I in addition to being the chairman of the board of the National Press Foundation, I'm the attorney for a few journalism trade associations, including the American Society of News Editors and the Association of Alternative News Media, both of which have legal hotlines. And though Dan Heyman does not work for an AAN member paper, we sort of allow others to contact us, specifically through a group called the Media Consortium. And his editor kind of remembered that And I remember I was actually at home in the afternoon, working from home, waiting for someone to come do some work on the house. And I get this call from a number I do not recognize in Colorado. And I let it go through, and then I screen it, and then I pick up the message. And it's I'm calling you through the legal hotline. This is a new situation to us. One of our reporters has been arrested. And it was clear that the person, the editor, kind of was, I was one of the first people she had called, if not the first. And we need, what do I do? Where do I go from here? So I gave her a few names. I mean, it was clear that I wasn't going to hop in my car and drive to Charleston to help get this person out of jail. So I said, here are a couple of resources you can use. You might want to contact the local ACLU chapter. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press has a legal hotline referral service where they might be able to get you some assistance. But that's eventually what happened. They were able to get him local counsel to start working to get him out of custody as soon as possible. But of course, the charges still haven't been dropped.
Exactly. I think it's been 2 months, and they arrested him, fingerprinted him, put him in an orange jumpsuit, and he spent, I think, the night in jail, or several hours anyway. And those charges are still standing, which, hopefully he's got a good lawyer by now.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, how does this even happen? Like, not how does the arrest happen? How does this continue to stand? How do these continue to stand as charges? This seems like a real opportunity for, the authorities to say, okay, look, kind of unlike what they've done with you as well, maybe, is, look, we should really just drop this now. It's not looking good for anyone. It's not the message we want to send. It's not the confrontation we want to have. But they stand, and this, the idea of a charge of willful disruption of government processes it's so vague and nebulous that I don't understand why they're trying to push this, other than the same reason we're here today. The culture is changing, right?
Exactly. So just one more example, and then we'll get to tips for journalists. The Guardian journalist Ben Jacob, who asked a question of a congressional candidate and was assaulted in front of eyewitnesses in Montana. So let's listen to that video.
Into the CBO score, because you were waiting to make your decision about healthcare until you saw the bill and it just came out. And what you thought.
We'll talk to you about that later.
Yeah, but there's not going to be time. I'm just curious if you have the
speak
right
with
now.
Shane, please.
But you don't.
Sick and tired of you guys. The last guy that came in here, you did the same thing. Get the hell out of here. Get the hell out of here. The last guy did the same thing. You were the Guardian.
Yes, and you just broke my glasses.
The last guy did the same damn thing.
You just body slammed me and broke my glasses.
Get the hell out of here.
If you'd like me to get the hell out of here, I'd also like to call the police. Can I get you guys' names?
Hey, you gotta leave.
He just body slammed me.
You gotta leave.
Now, he did a couple of interesting things. He called the police, and he got eyewitness accounts. So are those the kinds of things that would be useful in situations like the one that you faced, John, or just for in general if a journalist is roughed up like that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, to me, the main thing you need to do is don't be silent about it, and make sure people know about it and hold them to account. And that's what I tried to do, and that's what he did. And thank goodness a Fox News reporter, who was one of the only witnesses in that room who didn't work for the campaign, spoke up and gave testimony as to how violent this was. Real quick observation though on Gianforte, he deserves credit for, despite obviously it was despicable what happened, but he deserves credit later for giving a fulsome apology about it. Unlike the FCC chairman, and unlike what we saw in West Virginia, at least he owned up to it. Now, granted, he was facing criminal charges,
and
but
a civil lawsuit,
and a civil lawsuit. So maybe I shouldn't be too generous, but at least he did that right. But yeah, back to your question: speak up, get witnesses involved, get it out there.
When you saw in the Heyman video, there were other people there filming, and I don't think that was, I mean, obviously there is going to be a gut instinct on everybody in today's culture to pull out a camera, a smartphone and film that. But I also recollect people saying that he had actually said, could you please take a picture of this? Can you contact my editor? And I think that you're right. In the moment, there's a lot going on, but that's one thing you sort of want to prep for, is to at least keep your wits about you to do that perhaps, and make sure, as I said in some of my guidance to people, is try to lock eyes with someone in the crowd who might be sympathetic. There wasn't a crowd in any of these situations, but if you can do that and get them to realize you're in trouble, and they need to help you out, would be a good thing you can do in the moment.
Let's turn to some of the slides that Kevin prepared. Kevin, you say that newsrooms should have strategies. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think the key word is prepare. I mean, like I say here, I wouldn't send John Wall to the free throw line for that last second game winning, and we know he'll make it anyway, but we wouldn't set him up there without a lot of practice. He wouldn't go up there with a lot of practice. So why would we send any professional person into the field without any prep whatsoever or any idea of what they're doing? And I think it starts with sort of, especially because you're in the moment. The reason that athletes do this, the reason that actors rehearse a scene is for that muscle memory and that clarity of I'm prepared, even the mental feeling that I'm prepared. It's the reason you study for tests half the time is I'm prepared to be out there and I'm not going to panic. I'm not going to lose my wits about me. Well, that can happen too. If you've run through some of the scenarios in your head and they're not new to you and they're not new to your editor and you know kind of what to anticipate, I think in the moment everything does kind of, as they say, slow down just a little bit and you think more clearly for what might happen.
There have been enough of these incidents now that I do hope that newsroom leaders, try to figure out some guidelines and strategies and share those with the reporters and the photographers and the videographers who are out there on the front lines.
And they do. I mean, I did a version of this for AS&E members just 2 weeks ago. This was a component of an overall presentation we did on access issues, but this was one that I think people really wanted to hear, this part of it. How do you respond to, or how do you prepare for, as a newsroom leader, how do you prepare your people to go into the field like this? This really isn't new to some extent, though. I think it's escalating, but we talk about the Occupy Wall Street coverage from a few years ago, and people were getting arrested then. The people that were arrested in D.C., or at least swept up into dangerous situations, the people that were arrested in D.C. on Inauguration Day, it is not the first time reporters have been caught up in mass arrest in the District of Columbia at an event. So I think that the time is way overdue to have these conversations between reporters, editors, and lawyers, certainly.
So, Kevin, your next slide, where you talk about things that journalists should do. And, John, feel free to jump in here.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think among the things we talk about are sort of partner with others. This is what you talk about when you mention like having other people who have your back. I realize newsrooms are shorter staffed than ever. I'm not saying that everybody needs a buddy when they go into the field, but the buddy system may not be a bad idea at certain times. I mean, especially for someone like Ben Jacobs, it clearly would have been a nice thing to have someone there. I think it's more important when you're going into an outdoor situation where things could escalate very quickly. And the second person's job, even if it's just an intern or somebody, their job is really to be a spotter, to stay on the outside, to watch in case something happens, and run and get you help if necessary. One of the things I'll talk about ahead of time that maybe, I think kind of may have gotten you in a little bit of a precarious situation is take your relationship with the authorities from the adversarial to the amicable. This was a lesson I learned from my mentor, Dick Schmidt, who represented AS&E before me. It's from a different situation where he talked about press-bar relations in the late 60s and early 70s were terrible. I mean, covering courtrooms, lawyers did not want reporters in there at all. And it wasn't until they literally sat down and broke bread or perhaps shared some drinks together that people kind of understood the opposite side. It doesn't always have to be an adversarial relationship. I think one of the things that you already did say was you were a new guy at the FCC. They didn't know you. And maybe, understanding that if you had it to do over, would you go back and sort of say, I know you're tipping yourself off, but would you have sort of said, okay, maybe I should tell someone that I'm coming today and who I am? And it did seem pretty clear that you're a reporter.
They actually use that as an excuse, saying, we didn't know who you were, because you're not a regular reporter.
Yeah.
But to me, I shouldn't have to say, I just want you to know I'm a reporter. You know, when I'm sitting here with a press pass on, when I've just gone through this, you know, I've had this photographed, I've gone through the security, I've got a notepad and a recorder, and by their statements, they indicated that they knew I was a reporter. So I don't feel like that's something that you know, I should have had to have done, or anybody really. As long as you are, you know, credentialed, and you know, you shouldn't have to warn people that you're a reporter. But one thing I do want to mention that after this happened to me that I am glad I did was not fight back, and I think it's worth accentuating because. If I had, the story would have been reporter arrested on assault at FCC, okay, instead of guards, you know, abused reporter. So I think it's really important to keep your head and not start swinging, because it's, you know, you may need to protect yourself in some way. It depends on the circumstance. I mean, thank goodness I didn't have to, but I could very easily have snapped and done something that I would have regretted, and that would have changed the narrative and taken the focus off of them for the abusive stuff that they did.
You know, back to your statement though, you shouldn't have to do that. I mean, we shouldn't even be having this conversation, right? I mean, why are we here in 2017 in the United States of America having a conversation about how journalists can and should protect themselves from arrest and assault? I mean, this is kind of like, yeah, it's changing, and I think I agree with you. You shouldn't have to, but you know, I think more again for the truly explosive situations. You would not think though that going to the FCC and trying to ask a question would be one. But for the outdoor situations, especially where things are going to get crazy, I think the more you can do ahead of time to make yourself known as a non-threatening, friendly face. And I've known John for a long time, and John is not threatening. But so I don't fault him for this. But the more you can make yourself known ahead of time to certain people, the right people, or at least have some kind of relationship with the MPD or whatever town you're in, you know, it's got to help.
Well, make sure that your press credentials are out and visible. You know, keep business cards with you as an add-on identification. Know where the exits are. I think that's important.
Scout
if you're
out the location.
if you're in an outdoor situation, you know, where they've got protesters fenced in like they tend to do. You know how to get out. Let's talk about educating yourself on media law topics, something that we all did in college and then maybe not so much.
Well, I mean, we have something up here on the screen with some different organizations, and including ASNE and me, and the same would be true for AAN if you're members of that organization. You know, is that you should definitely jot these down. In fact, some people have gone so far, of course, as to say you should be writing these on your arm or on your person, at least one number to get your to have if you need it. You know, they should be, you know, pre-saved into your phone, and so you can just hit an emergency dial. I mean, maybe you change that to an emergency number in your phone, one of these numbers, if you are going out into the field that day. These are things you would think about. Like, I have 3 emergency contacts in my phone. It's probably my mom, my wife, my dad, right? But on a day where I know I could be in trouble, and this is not every day. This is this is one of the things you assess the situation ahead of time. Would I put one of those in as an emergency contact in my phone that day? But knowing the media law is really about sort of knowing where you can push things in different areas. And I'm not asking anybody to be an expert on any of this. I'm probably not an expert after 22 years of doing it. But in reality, there are certain things you need to know that you know, where you can go, where you cannot go, when you need to back off, when you can make your stand. I mean, because a law enforcement officer says stop recording doesn't always mean you have to stop recording. At that point, it becomes a calculation again. Do you fight back? Certainly not. Do you continue recording? Perhaps, because you probably, in most instances, have a legitimate right to do that, to continue to record. You may be told you have to leave somewhere, but again, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to put the camera down. You can film, especially with smartphones. You can certainly film as you're walking away. You can audio record as you walk away. If we're looking at a slide now that talks about the Privacy Protection Act, which I think a lot of people should know and understand as to when your possessions and property can be seized by law enforcement as a journalist. And you can assert these firmly, forcefully, respectfully, and protect yourself in the moment.
Yeah, so I actually think that law is very important for
Yeah.
journalists to know about. You know, they should have that on their phone or on a card in their wallet so they can pull that out and say, this federal law says you cannot confiscate my cell
Unless,
phone, my camera, my video cam, you know, all of those things. Another strategy for reporters with their equipment is to encrypt it so that if they do take your equipment, at least your information is protected. I doubt they can break the encryption before the lawyers get involved.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's back up a second and talk a little bit about public places. Like what's fair game for reporters and what is not. Now, we all know that 9/11 changed the rules in a lot of federal buildings, and I assume buildings out in the states as well. But is there a general rule or guideline where reporters can be to stake out officials and
mean, if
where
it's-
they can't be?
If it's a public place, you're supposed to be there. Now, things may change quickly or you're supposed to be allowed to be there. Things may change quickly in the moment in a heated situation, and law enforcement or someone else may say, security may say, well, in this situation, we need you out of here now. But generally, in a public government building, if any member of the public is allowed to be there, a reporter is allowed to be there. I mean, and that's always been very clear. Now, you've said there might be, John can talk to a little bit more about the rules in the Capitol about when you can start filming, when you cannot film, when, again, when certain rules have been laid out for specific reasons to, take that, what we call public forum, and make it very much, a non-public forum in the moment. But generally the default is if it's public and the public can be there, reporters can be there, and the justification has to be shown, for a very specific reason why you shouldn't be allowed there.
I mean, and of course there are some areas that are restricted, not just in the moment, but on basically a permanent basis. And I don't know. I assume people's offices are included there, and this is a matter of decorum. You might not be so successful in getting your question answered if you barge into somebody's office. But I think about federal office buildings, for example. There are certain areas that are clearly marked off as restricted, but others that are not. For example, the hallways outside people's offices. Reporters might think that would be a good place to catch somebody. I heard a friend of mine who's a reporter who covers the Justice Department said that they had verbally started to talk about restricting areas where reporters can go. Apparently they didn't put this in writing, but they kind of sent out the message that we don't want you hanging around certain areas, and this is a new development this year. And I don't know all the details about that, but that's the kind of stuff we have to guard against. Like, wait a minute, we have always been able to be in this hallway. What are you doing? And just whenever they try to do that stuff, push back. And if they're stupid enough to put it in writing, then that makes it even easier to push back against. But that sort of stuff is happening, and we've seen that happening in the Capitol a little bit recently too, which I can talk about if you like.
Yeah, maybe we'll get to that.
Get back to that
at the end, John.
Okay.
What about open meetings? When I started out as a journalist, we literally had a card that I think SPJ put out that that you could stand up and read if they tried to throw you out of a meeting. Where can journalists get information on open meetings laws? Is that a state-by-state thing, Kevin, or is there a federal law that governs that?
Well, there are dual systems, really. Of course, you have the federal, Sunshine and Government Act, and then you have at the state level you have various 50 states and the District of Columbia have open meetings laws. And every one of them is going to be sort of the same, but sort of different. Their default again is openness, unless certain prescribed occurrences, exist or prescribed situations exist. A lot of those tend to track the FOIA laws of the state. So if matters of personal privacy are being discussed, or government contracts are being discussed that are of a proprietary nature, then the meeting may be put into executive session. But overall, that is another thing you can look for, and other resources there would be The many state open government coalitions that exist are going to help you at your state and local level understand what those are. They may have resources. Again, full disclosure, I'm a member of the board of directors of the DC Open Government Coalition, and we have information on our website about that you can find at dcogc.org. And every
Say that
state,
again.
dcogc.org.
Oh, okay.
And most of the states have those, and they're going to have those resources or have a contact for you. And it is good to take a look at that and understand before you go in what you can and cannot do. I mean, most of these say exactly that you are allowed to be there.
We've got a question, and I think I understand it correctly, that should you fight back if you sense you are in danger?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to flick at that you are entitled to protect yourself, and so if somebody's trying to punch me in the face, I'm going to try to block it, and I may very well hit back if that's the case. But if an officer is putting my hands behind my back to arrest me, even if he has no justification for it, I'm not going to fight. I'm not going to fight back. I'm going to fight back later in court or in the media. But so it depends on the situation. But I certainly would never tell somebody that they're not entitled to protect themselves.
I think fight back might be a little strong. I think take steps to protect yourself is certainly, absolutely what you want to do. And it's amazing because, we would talk about, I know there are groups out there that do journalism training or training for journalists who are going into the field, usually overseas, security training. I mean, are we at the point now where we need to sort of have these conversations internally about self-defense for journalists,
Some news organizations did that during the campaign last year because there was the press was in being called out at political rallies, and some journalists felt like they were in danger.
Yeah, and there's a building stream of threats against reporters online, especially, and by email and on social media, and I'm hearing more and more about this, and it's definitely a cause for serious concern.
Yeah, and I think so to sum up the sort of thoughts on the last question to me is fighting back again might be a bit strong, but as John said, there may be a time where it's absolutely necessary to actually protect yourself. I would guess doing that against a police officer probably is never going to be a winning battle. It's just, I cannot imagine that that's someone you want to fight back against.
Don't you have a guiding rule on that?
Yes, never pick a fight with a man holding a gun. Yeah, seems pretty clear to me.
Right. I guess we've talked about some of the things that I've got on here, but lawyering up, let's talk about, we talked about the hotline numbers a little bit, but why don't you talk about institutional legal representation?
Well, we've talked about that. If you're a member of, if you're not a member of a professional association, I mean, this is not unique to AS&E or AAN. Every one of these organizations has a lawyer and has the ability to put you in touch with someone. And again, so you should, even if you're a freelancer, there's got to be some way for you to find your way into an organization that can give you that. I have no, like I said, the editor from the Public News Service, I have no idea where to turn. I just remembered you provide this service. Can I call you? And again, put that into your phone on speed dial, write it on your arm, whatever you have to do. I think I think part of that is that it's very hard for me, I'll tell you from my experience as an attorney, to get a cold call and immediately say, okay, I'm your attorney, I can represent you now. It's, there are certain legal processes that are or certain processes that are required of attorneys before we're actually your attorney. Even when I'm representing, AAN or AS&E as through the legal hotline process, I'm really still the attorney for the association, not the individual. What I can do is start helping out though. And I think the more you can do to cut through the red tape at the beginning, the better, even if it is just making sure you have access to one of those hotlines.
John, what did you do in your case? I mean, what did your organization have legal counsel that you talked to at the time?
No, there was no. We didn't go there. I mean, we decided not to pursue any kind of legal avenues. So instead, as I said earlier, we shined a pretty bright light on what they did, and I think that was a good way to go. Yeah,
actually, that's the next step, I think, is that we should not let these incidents go, that we should be writing about it and talking about it. If you Google John Donnelly and FCC, You get
Yes,
hundreds of thousands of hits.
The word manhandled will forever
It's
be
amazing.
associated with my name, so for better or worse.
So what other ways do we have of keeping that conversation going so that these things aren't forgotten?
Well, things like this, events like this. We mentioned a couple things. I guess I could, if I could talk a little bit about what happened on Capitol Hill recently. Some new staffer on the Senate Rules Committee, which has oversight of security over there, decided to enforce an old rule that nobody had ever enforced. And a lot of our freedoms are actually just institutional precedents, just sort of traditions and how things have gone. In this case, somebody decided to take a new approach and require that people who want to audio and videotape interviews with senators have to get written permission from the senator. Well, that didn't go over very well, and the reason I'm bringing it up is because of the response. The response was great in that there was so much pushback and so much howl, not just from the press, but also from senators and members of Congress who recognize the importance of being able to just talk to reporters whenever they get asked a question, for them to do their jobs and get their message out. So because of the pushback, that effort withered, thank goodness. But this kind of thing is always going to come back, and when it does, we just have to make sure that people know about it and there's strong reaction.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, I was going to say the Gianforte Jacob situation was pretty instructive as well. Even though in the end, Gianforte won his election, I think public opinion, at least in the initial moments afterwards, when Ben Jacobs tweeted this, and I mean it went far and wide pretty quickly. I won't go so far as to say necessarily viral, but I think that was a very good thing on his part. Like, it was very simple. I think I remember almost verbatim, it was something along the lines of, I was just assaulted by the congressional candidate for Montana. Body slam, yes.
Right.
And I think it's very factual. It was, it was. And I think that caught a lot of eyes. You actually tweeted some stuff afterward and got some responses, some interesting responses from Mike O'Reilly's office too, I think, which were also amazing. What was the response he gave to your immediate tweet?
Well, first he said he didn't know who I was. By the way, we never met, so he talked about me as if we were familiar. He said he didn't know, John, I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what was happening. And I replied, you were looking right at me when it happened. And then he gave a couple of other excuses, and then his last excuse was, I was freezing and tired, or something to that effect.
Freezing and starving,
freezing,
I think.
freezing and starving.
They don't pay an FCC.
Yes, he just needed a Snickers bar, I think. So yeah, that was kind of amusing.
So yeah, use Twitter and social media, which has some immediacy that that waiting to write a piece, or in the case of the Montana incident, I know the Fox reporter wound up writing a sort of an eyewitness account of what she saw too, but that takes time. Social media can be instantaneous.
Yeah, and it can draw their people out immediately to back you up as well, which is useful. I think again, looking at the slides here, personalizing it, explaining why it matters to the public at large is important. You cannot make it, you can personalize it without making it all about yourself, which is, again, I think what the original Jacobs tweet was. It was matter of fact. I mean, you can't say anything but, I was body slammed. But, oh, woe is me, any of that, histrionics about it are not a big deal. Your back and forth with Mike O'Reilly was completely appropriate. Well, you did this. No, I did this. No, you really didn't. And then if you go back and write about it, you have to make it about what the public is losing. We all know neither I suppose, government officials nor the media are held in the highest regard overall by the public. But so you don't want to further alienate people. But you do have to tell the story, and I think you do have to make it relatable to those people. You have to make them understand why this will ultimately harm them. And I don't think you can give it up.
Actually, let me interrupt you for a second. We just had a question about that very thing. So there have been all of these attacks or assaults, incidents involving reporters. Why should the public care?
Okay, I'll
You
address
are
that.
absolutely.
I mean, because I've seen I've seen a lot of people refer to me and to others as snowflakes or whatever, or babies, because it's not about us at all. Because the reporters, we are there to represent the public. We are there to provide the public with information that American citizens need to have a functioning democracy. That's why it matters. That's who we are, and that's what we are doing. And when we are attacked, you are attacked. You in the public are attacked. And so you should take it personally, and that's why you should care.
Kevin?
I think you should care because we've, as I said, this is sort of new in the United States, but it's not new elsewhere. And John, I know, as the Press Freedom Committee chair for a long time for the National Press Club, you're very aware of what's been going on overseas, and especially in Turkey. I think that's very instructive as to what's happening there. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that as an example of why we need to avoid the same thing here.
Well, in Russia too.
Yeah.
I mean, in any number of places. We tend to think of ourselves as a special, anointed place that we're impervious to these kind of things. But we're seeing all the same patterns that we see in Russia and Turkey, and calling out the press as enemies of the state, and actually talking about violence and putting out internet memes about violence against the press, and this idea that but they're not accurate, they're not fair, so therefore all manner of things are justified, but of course we're not going to be accurate and fair in every instance, and we make mistakes, but when we do, most of the time it's an honest mistake and we try to correct it. And so, yeah, we can't think of ourselves as somehow impervious to the tides of history, because we see them all over the world.
And I think overall what happens is the culture that's created, especially if you look at the arrests and assaults and the deterrent effect they are intended to have, not just have, but are intended to have. I don't think this, I definitely see a trickle-down effect. These are not, the fact that we've had more of these, I think, in recent months than ever before is a change in culture. And it's not unintentional, I think, in some regards, and it's being emboldened and it will only worsen to the point where we really are, kind of like Turkey or Russia, where you have it's not that you have no rights, it's that you don't have the will to go and ask the question, or you have a fear of going in and asking the question. And that may not seem like a big deal. It may all seem like political theater if somebody is, I'm sorry, the whole thing of a White House briefing may seem like political theater until it's not. What happens if a bunch of reporters didn't want to stake out outside the Washington Hilton in March 1981 because they were sick and tired of being harassed or fearful or something else? What would have happened if nobody was around that day that Reagan was shot? That's what we risk losing. It may seem mundane, it may seem ludicrous, it may seem like it doesn't matter until it does.
Until it does, right. Kevin's got another slide, what to do if preparation fails.
Yeah, like I said, we've gone over a lot of this. Try not to panic. Hopefully your training kicks in, and you remain calm. You remain firm. You re-identify yourself as press, and hopefully you've cultivated that. One thing we didn't talk about, John's right. He pointed out his natty attire here, and I think that's very important. I've heard about reporters who have been swept up in protest while covering protest as protesters, and I heard one of them, was dressed in all black, and because there was tear gas, had a bandana on. I'm like, I don't know, man. Maybe that's not the way to go. Maybe looking the part is going to help you when they're deciding who to grab and arrest or who to assault. I mean, who they think is likely of committing a violent act and who is not. But I think, so there is a little bit of that. Remain professional overall is really what it is. Again, try to lock eyes with someone in the crowd that you can convey the urgency of the situation too. It's going to be very hard. Your emotions are going to be going. You're going to be panicked. I'm sure you're pinned up against the wall and you're kind of you're half panicked, looking out, scanning the crowd, like what's about to happen here. But I would assume that if there's a way to make people realize like this is happening, like you said, get people's attention. That's a big deal. And if you can hit that record button yourself or have it recording somehow, do it, because that's irrefutable evidence, I think, in most instances as to what actually happened. Not a he said, she said.
And you suggested to me that reporters carry around enough cash so that they can post bond. I mean, what would that typically be?
I mean, it's a couple hundred at least. I mean, you have to be ready though. It's definitely another thing to think about when you're out there. I mean, maybe that's another piece of research you do. How much is it to post bond at MPD if I get arrested? You don't think about these things normally, but look, if you're thinking about what, the worst case scenario, which is lawyers, as a lawyer, it's usually our job to think that and then work backwards. That would be one thing that I would strongly recommend is maybe in your media law training or your legal overview is look at the procedure of where will I be? Where am I most likely to be taken? It's hard in DC because you have 30-some different police different types of police that could arrest you. But I would say looking at who they might be and what basic procedures are going to happen is useful.
Mm-hmm. And Kevin, you have one point about insurance, which is something I think a lot of journalists aren't familiar with.
Yeah. Again, understand. What does your insurance cover? Most of the time, a media organization's insurance will cover what you print on paper or broadcast on television or publish online.
No, and what kind of insurance is that?
That's just basically like what we call errors and omissions insurance, for lack of a better term. But you may want to get some kind of umbrella policy which covers you. I mean, some of this is going to be covered perhaps by workman's comp. I'm not an employment attorney, but the bigger issue is for freelancers. I think make sure you have some policy, and this is always freelancers. In every conceivable sense, tend to be left in the middle of all of this. I mean, even with regard to the basics of defamation, errors, and omissions, we always find that, if you're a freelancer, the publication you're working for doesn't cover you under their policy, and then it's very hard for you as a freelancer to get your own because the companies don't want to cover you unless you have a steady working gig and evidence that you're always going to have strong editorship behind you to check what you do. Well, now you have to do that again in terms of other insurance, and sometimes you may say, do I have, in the greater context of things, do I have insurance that's going to cover my physical injuries? Well, depending on the job you're doing, you may now decide you absolutely need that, and think about it at least.
I have worked for organizations where if I was working with freelancers, they insisted that the freelancers have a certain amount of insurance. Yeah. And my recollection was that it cost about $100 a year, which is probably worth having if you're a freelancer. Would an organization like the Reporters Committee have information on that, or can you suggest a place where a freelancer would go?
I think they would. They're definitely. I think that's one. There are some smaller organizations, like I think it's called Lion, which is more of a local publishers, which is going to have some information about that. Maybe the Press Club. I'm sure there are a lot of freelancers that are with the Press Club. You may want to check into the National Press Club about that. Another benefit of this is that quite often the insurance companies themselves can be a great referral source for attorneys, and actually will have a certain legal hotline of their own that you can call into once you're covered by insurance. That would be another reason to get it. In fact, to have access to an attorney right from the start, even if you don't, as a freelancer, have it already.
Right. So, go
Can
ahead,
I just
John.
go back really, because it kind of sticks in my craw that somebody would ask a question: why should we care about reporters being assaulted?
I didn't want to call them out.
And to me, that's really the heart of this whole issue, and it's a huge concern that there is a substantial portion of the American public that would have to ask that question, right? That would not understand the role that the press plays. And to the extent that there is a large slice of the public that doesn't understand that, we're going to have a big problem. And there's going to be people who are going to take it too far and think that, you look at the situation with, the Comet Pizza, deal, where somebody believed some fake news and decided to take matters into his own hands with a weapon. That we're going to see that happen to a reporter. I think it's just a matter of time. And we need to really, and I say we, I mean us here, the National Press Foundation, the National Press Club, all these groups, we need to really think about educating the public about the importance of the press, just the fundamental role of the press. Because as long as people, a large number of people don't get that, we're not going to be very well protected.
Yeah, I was actually just hoping that was like the world's biggest softball question to have us tease that out of us, because I was wondering the same thing. You're watching a National Press Foundation webinar. You're asking us that question. It seems, but again, it may seem very obvious to us, and that's kind of the problem.
That's what I mean.
Obvious
That's what
to
I
us.
mean. It's
Yeah.
not. Yeah, it is obvious to us, but it's not obvious to a hell of a lot of people.
Yeah, and in this environment, it's important for us to explain why, the importance of the First Amendment, our role in that, their role in the First Amendment. It doesn't just apply to freedom of the press. There are many freedoms in that amendment, and that's I think that's a subject for another day. So.
Well, the Atlantic, I think, had a piece on this just within the last week that I was reading about how the press can better advocate for itself in these instances, and that would be something to look at if people want to search. It was really within the last 2 weeks, and it explained that pretty well.
And John, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about what's going on here in Washington. You served on the Standing Committee of Correspondence, you on the Press Club's Press Freedom Committee. Is there anything that our audience should know about the roles of those organizations or any imminent issues that have come to the fore?
Well, recently there have been a growing number of reporters on the Hill badgering members of Congress for comments about what's going on up Pennsylvania Avenue mainly. And so things are getting more and more crowded there. And I alluded earlier to this attempt to restrict where and when and how reporters can audio and videotape members of Congress. So that is sort of an ongoing concern up there. It's just a physical safety thing where they're worried that somebody's going to get hurt or trampled or whatever, because there's just a lot of reporters. You're looking at a picture now, a lot of reporters in a small space. But we need to be really careful, because this is exactly the kind of thing that people can use as a pretext to limit reporters, and they tried a couple weeks ago to limit how we can do our jobs, and we have to be vigilant about that and make sure that we beat back any such attempts. But it's an ongoing issue up there as we speak.
We've got a question here. Is the press legally required to have identification or credentials?
No. I mean, there are certain places you absolutely won't get into without a credential. Obviously, like we've talked about the White House, you're not getting into the White House, and you're not getting into certain areas perhaps in the Capitol without a hard pass, in the Pentagon.
Right.
But no, there's no so those might be specific rules, but overall as a member, in fact, one of the great things about, one of the more fundamental aspects of the First Amendment in the United States, and another thing that sets us apart from other countries, is we have no licensing of journalists here. You don't have to apply, you don't have to go to school, you don't have to show that you are fit for the job and apply to the government for permission to be a journalist. It's just not something that happens.
But just walking into a meeting or a public space or anywhere with just a pen and a pad, I mean, it's always smarter to have a credential and to get a credential if you work for an organization that qualifies for one.
But I think this is a key point that the First Amendment applies to the American public, because the news is being reported not just by reporters, more and more because of the ubiquitous nature of smartphones. The news is being reported by ordinary citizens, and a lot of ordinary citizens don't know that they are legally entitled to film anywhere, basically, unless it's a classified or restricted area, or a private inside someone's home or something. But if you're out on the street and you're filming the police can't tell you to put your camera down. That's just a fact, and I think a great number of people don't know that.
Reaffirmed just in the last week by another United States Court of Appeals, federal court, that citizens, and it's funny because in that case,
explain that, Kevin.
Well, in that case, I think it was in Philadelphia that the question was really kind of, one of the questions posed to the court was, does there have to be any intent on the part of the person filming to want to shed light on the activities of the police? And the court kind of didn't even ask that. They said, no, you have a right to film the police. That's it. As long as you're not getting in the way. And again, journalists, by the same token, journalists are not immune from laws of general applicability. So you can't rush into a situation to get your close-up while an officer's trying to arrest someone.
Good point.
And get in the way and suddenly then pull out your credential and say, no, it's cool, I'm a journalist, I'm allowed to be here. But it's very clear that we have the right in public to film law enforcement officials doing their jobs, even in the heat of battle.
Or film whatever the heck we want.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
But yeah, I'm glad you raised that, because there's obviously limits. You know,
Yeah.
you need to stand back. You know, you can say to the officer, "Is this back far
Yeah.
enough?" And you know, I mean, once they say no, you need to go to. If you're in Philadelphia, no, you need to go to Scranton, and that's far enough. Well, now then they're obviously
Yes.
not being reasonable.
And I just wanted to give a shout out to the National Press Club, which I think we're all members of the Press Club, and they had the foresight to appoint a First Amendment fellow at a very opportune time, and that is Kathy Kiley. So we all know Kathy
She's
and
great.
appreciate the work that she's doing.
She's doing a great job.
So thank you, both of you. Today we've learned strategies for mitigating risk while reporting, as well as what to do if you are arrested or assaulted. Our thanks to media attorney Kevin Goldberg and CQ roll call reporter John Donnelly. Resources from this webinar will be posted for your use on NPF's website at nationalpress.org, where we make good journalists better.